The first thing I want to say about all of this isn't a matter of data, but is a matter that we're going to come back to in a moment. And it should be if you get nothing else out of this video, reactionary politics is the worst politics. Reactionary politics cannot breed anything other than terrible policy, no matter what that's related to. And that's especially true in the case of mass and school shootings, which, for the record, are extremely rare. And when I say rare, I mean ridiculously, incredibly, extremely rare. And that is, you can see here, according to even PBS, they are actually uncommon incidents that account for just 0.2% of firearm deaths, not 0.2% of deaths, not 0.2% of the likelihood that you're actually going to run into them, but 0.2% of firearm deaths. And the highest number of firearm deaths since 1981 was, 2020. And I think we all know what the reason for that is. But here's your firearm deaths, again, according to usafacts.org. And what you guys are going to see is I'm using deliberately left-wing sources. These are sources that absolutely have an agenda, that absolutely have a gun control agenda. And that's because I'm trying to take the most charitable take of my opposition. And we're still going to be able to present the same conclusion. All right, so let's go to what it says here. 45,222 deaths, which if you pump that into your calculator, 0.2% of 45,222 deaths is, about 90 deaths per year. Folks, if you want links, let me know in the comment section and I'll share the links. We've got a lot of links to go over tonight. So I'm not going to be constantly stopping so I can pump them into the comment section. Let me know if there's a link you want, and I'll get to it when I get a chance. So the highest number of firearm deaths since 1981 was 45,222, which equates to just 90 deaths in that year if we're to use the highest numbers. Now, that isn't to say they aren't a tragedy. They are absolutely a tragedy. But that's extraordinarily rare. That's unbelievable. The likelihood of you dying in even so much as a mass shooting, which is defined as a shooting in which there are greater than or equal to 4 victims that were killed, regardless of whether or not the perpetrator was also killed in the mass shooting. And the number, by the way, of mass shootings, and this is going to surprise folks, I think, the highest number was in 2019 at 471. Most of these don't actually result. The highest number of mass shootings, according to Gun Violence Archive, and we're going to come back to deaths in a minute, which is a little bit different of a definition. This is 471. Here is what those results look like. Excuse me. I just got to hide something real quick. There we go. So this is where those mass shootings are. What do you notice about all of this? They're all in gigantic cities, right? They're all in crap hole cities. You'll also notice that there are some gigantic cities, some pretty decently sized cities that aren't on this list. This is 2022, of course, by the way. You're not going to see Fargo, North Dakota on this list. You're not going to see Boise, Idaho on this list. You're not going to see Billings, Montana. These are cities that are at least the size of Hartford, Connecticut. You can see a dot for Hartford, Connecticut in 2022. You're not going to see one for these type of places. So the trend is big cities. And, it's borne out in the data. So again, if we're going to go back to if we're going to go back to USA Facts, there's your firearm deaths. That's total firearm deaths, right? What we care about, of course, are the homicides, so it would be nice to break those out. But unless you're living in one of these giant cities, the likelihood of you being shot and killed at all is unbelievably low. So that's the trend of things and where things come from, that these things are happening. The reason you're not hearing about a lot of this is because they're coming from these huge cities, and we'll get to the narrative in just a minute. There is another way to define these sort of things. Now, I said mass shootings. What are mass murders? Well, we can go to that as well. These are the number of mass murders. So mass murders are a shooting in which there are, according to the FBI, is a lot smaller of a number. Let me bring that up for you. This is according to the FBI. So according to the FBI, they're pretty doggone rare. So when I said shootings before, I think I probably should use the definition that was used by, what was that source I had before? The Gun Violence Archive. So it's greater than or equal to 4 victims. And according to the FBI, it's greater than or equal to 4 deaths. So this is how unbelievably rare mass murders are. And if you want to compare mass public shootings, which is a little bit different, we can go to gunfacts.info. So the question, of course, then is, where do we stack up, compare? What does all this mean, right? Is this actually like a lot? Is this something that we should be looking at? Is this something we should be comparing ourselves to other countries with? Well, this is what we look like when we compare ourselves to other countries. And let me go ahead and zoom this in so folks can see this a little bit better. Yeah, there are a lot of countries that have way more mass public shooting deaths than we do here in the United States. Now, I realize that 2012 is a little bit old data, but that's the most recent data I can get if we're going to compare ourselves in terms of mass public shooting deaths. Again, the definitions are changing a little bit as we go. Part of the reason I'm doing this is to show you that when you define, it's important to properly define things. Otherwise, you're going to lose the data. You're going to lose the point here. Again, in the United States, pretty doggone rare. And despite the graph that you've seen, compared to other countries, compared to the bottom end of those countries, we're really not that far off from the median when it comes to mass public shootings. And we're really not that far off from the bottom end of things when it comes to the mass public shootings. And the lesson to be taken here is, despite the media hype, these incidents are extraordinarily rare. And to account for all, to extrapolate this even further, here's a list of the most deadly. Why is this? Here we go. Most deadly shootings. And what you'll find is, if we scroll all the way to the bottom, you're going to recognize some of these. You're going to recognize them, right? Las Vegas shooting in 2017, 58 people dead plus the gunman. This is one of those rare cases. This is actually one of those common cases where we're not going to be, or in this case, in the case of Las Vegas, we're probably never, ever going to know the motivation behind all of this. Then there was the Orlando nightclub shooting in 2016 with 48 dead. And we're on YouTube and we're on Facebook, so I can't go into the motivations behind that shooting, where the perpetrator was Omar Mateen. So I can't go into Omar Mateen's motivations, though they are very obvious. There was the Virginia Tech shooting, which, again, 32 dead, and I can't go into his motivations because Sung Hyo Cho killed 32 people. So unfortunately, we can't go into his motivations because we're on Facebook and we're on YouTube, and there's a narrative to maintain. And then as we go around, you're going to see Sandy Hook at 27. You're going to see the Sutherland Springs at 26. You're going to see a Louis Cafeteria in Texas in 1991 at 23, plus the gunman. You're going to see El Paso, Texas Mall, which happened in 2019, 22 dead. And as we scroll down, you're going to see that these are going to become older and more obscure. 1984, 21 dead. Then there's Marjorie Stoneman Douglas in 2018, 17. And those numbers, Columbine in 1919, 13 plus the 2 gunmen. Oklahoma Post Office, 1986. You're going to see 1966 from the clock tower gunman. We're going to get into to low end of double digits and single digits really quick. So if you ever look at things like risk of dying during one of these types of shootings, you have to understand that a handful of these shootings, mass shootings, are accounting for virtually all of the deaths that have resulted from these mass shootings. And yeah, I know what folks are going to say. Like, Mike, none of this is news. We know about all of these shootings. We've all heard of this. And you may say you hear about these things all of the time. Okay, so what I want, one of the other lessons I want people to understand is, do not succumb to the plane crash effect. It's something I went over in a video on my series on It's something that I went over on my series on philosophical concepts. Hope folks will check this out. I actually will share this link in the comments section here. So let me bring this up. Here's the YouTube comments. Go ahead and check that link out. That's on my YouTube channel, where I go into the plane crash effect. What is the plane crash effect? In short, the idea is you ask somebody, what's the safest way to travel per passenger mile? Well, the answer is by plane. Well, you hear about planes crashing all the time. Well, yeah, because it's news when they crash. Not only is it news because it's rare, but it's also news because it's always a mass tragedy. It's always lots and lots of people instantly vaporizing in a ball of fire, right? The reason you hear about plane crashes all the time, apparently, is because you hear about all of them. When it comes to these mass shootings, the reason, and the school shootings as well, the reason you hear about them happening all the time is because you hear about all of them, right? That is, in short, the plane crash effect. I go into greater detail in that video. Do check it out. Reactionary politics makes for bad politics and policy. Understand that the media is always going to cover every single one of these mass shootings when it's politically convenient, so you're going to hear about it all the time, right? But that doesn't change the fact that these sort of things are extremely rare. And we talked about mass shootings, so now let's go into school shootings. And this is how unbelievably rare school shootings are as well. This is from the Center for Homeland Defense and Security. So because this is kind of small, let's zoom in on this one as well. Let's make this as big as I can make it and still be able to see it. So the red is non-active shooter. We're going to come back to what the definition of active and non-active shooter is, and it's going to be extremely relevant. So what we're going to actually do is just look at active shooter. That's the number of active shooter incidents by year, going back to 1970. So you can see it wasn't all that common in the 1970s where we had, 1, 2, 3 a year. But even in the highest year, we're talking about going from 1 or 2 or 3 to 11, to 7, to 1, to 9, to 2. Okay, so again, though they have increased over time since, say, the 1970s, we're still talking about an infinitesimally small and extraordinarily rare incident. It is not appropriate to make policy, to make general the rule out of what is obviously the extraordinarily rare exception to the rule. This is why reactionary politics are bad politics, right? So we see how rare they are, and I explained that we'd go over what an active shooter is, so let's find out what an active shooter is. Okay, let's go to active shooter. Boom. In addition to the situation, incidents are labeled as an active shooter when, and I've highlighted this part, the shooter killed and or wounded victims, either targeted or random, within the school campus during a continuous episode of the violence. So active shooter basically means there was an actual shooting. It basically means in the case of a school shooting, it wasn't some hunter who happened to accidentally come into some field, on some 100-acre school campus and shoot a deer, right? That's what that means. That's why when we go back to a non-active shooter versus active shooter, the real number to look at is the active shooter number. These are incredibly rare incidences. But when it comes to these incredibly rare incidences, where are they actually happening? Now, there's another, according to the same database, we can look at the total number of incidences over a much larger period. So let's look at what that looks like. Do I have this right? Is this the right graph I want to bring up? Yeah, okay. So where are these happening? Let's zoom in a little bit on this one too so you guys can see it better. Where actually are these things happening? It's going to speak to a greater issue, which we're going to get into in a minute. The majority are happening in the parking lot. Yeah, 9.9% in the classroom. And then we have beside the building, in the hallway, okay, in front of the school, on the football field, on the school bus, outside on school property. In a field general. Okay, so if we take all of these slices of the pie that are definitely might not be like the courtyard, but definitely are not inside the four walls of the actual physical building, we're talking about 59% of these school shootings are taking place not within the four walls of the buildings. So for people that are saying what we need to do is lock down the actual doors, remember that the type of school shooting that you hear about in the news is not the type of school shooting that is the most common type of school shooting. And that's further evidenced by where, in terms of geography, these school shootings are taking place. We have to zoom this out to see this correctly. So from the same place, the Center for Homeland Defense and Security, we have another dot map. What do these dots say? Again, gigantic cities. If we go to, let's say, what this cluster is, right? We can go in here and we can see, holy crap, that is a lot of shootings over the last however many years. Just outside Chicago, Norwich, Chicago. Drive-by shooting, illegal activity, drive-by shooting, escalation of dispute, illegal activity, drive-by shooting, accidental, right? We can go then into places like Baltimore, all right? Look at where these dots are. Baltimore. So the overwhelming majority of these dots, and we can go to LA and see another giant cluster of dots. LA, Athens, LA, Compton, Long Beach, right? Like we would expect to see what? Some Inglewood always up to no good. Fairfax High School in LA. Let's go to Connecticut, right? Let's go to Connecticut where we have some cities. Bridgeport, Hartford, right? Population over 100,000. So let's go to another city that's got a population of over 100,000. Fargo, North Dakota, which is, none. None over the 20-something years of this period, not one. Okay? What is this telling you? What is all of this telling you? Right? We can actually go into, what's the chart idea that I want? Yeah. Now we can go back to, now that we've seen that dot matrix, we've seen where in terms of the physical properties these shootings are happening, we can see what's basically motivating these sort of things. Number one motivation is escalation of dispute. This is the type of shooting we're talking about. Not necessarily the motivation, but the type of shooting. Escalation of dispute. Accidental, which is something different. Suicide attempt. Illegal activity. Drive-by shooting. Indiscriminate shooting. Domestic with targeted gang wars. This is just gang wars. This is inner city gang wars. This is not the type of shooting that we get in Uvalde, Texas. It's not the type of shooting that we're getting in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, right? This is not the type of shooting that makes the news. And we all know why. And we all know why, who it is that are in these gangs in these inner cities. And we all know that because I'm on YouTube and I'm on Facebook, all I can say about all of this is that the reason these ones don't get covered is because Thugnificent shooting up another Thugnificent with a stolen gun that's been bandying around the gang for decades and is going to always remain stolen, doesn't fit the narrative. So you're not going to get that conversation. Speaking of which, the overwhelming majority of these things are done with handguns, which again speaks to what I was just saying. This is statista.org.com. This, I believe, is I want to say this is data driven by Johns Hopkins in partnership with Johns Hopkins. I want to say in the FBI, but here we are. According to statista.com, it's the overwhelming majority are done with handguns, not rifles. Again, what is this speaking towards? It's not speaking towards the type of gun really matters in these situations. And we can even do the same thing. If we look at the number of deaths, what we can do to get those number of deaths is derive them from, well, here's a listing on Wikipedia of at least 95 of the incidences that have taken place, school shootings that have taken place since 2000. 2000 usually being the starting point because Columbine happened right before all of this, and that's when we get a lot more data as a result of Columbine. Well, somebody has actually gone through the effort. I realize this is just some dude basically on the internet, but he's gone through the effort to put these statistics together, and what have they shown? 95 total events, gun type, handgun. Quote unquote assault rifle is 7, shotgun is 7, total deaths 232. By gun type, again, handgun 139, quote unquote assault rifle 51. Again, it's not the rifle that's doing this. It's the super majority of not only the number of incidences, but also the number of deaths are happening with handguns, not rifles. Not short barrel rifles, not long rifles, not rifles of any kind. Handguns. Handguns. And again, the reason I'm bringing all this up is because this is not the narrative you're going to hear, but this is what the data show. We talked about the theme of the show today was going to be facts, 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 facts. And this is what we're seeing. 2/3 of all school shootings are with handguns. And the thing is too that we can compare ourselves to, when it comes to these shootings, to other countries, right? And let's bring up what that looks like. These are mass public shootings in advanced countries, 1998 to 2012. I know it's going to be really hard to see this font, but that's where we are, right here. Right in the middle, right about in the middle in terms of both the number of incidences, the number wounded, and the number killed. Mass public shootings in advanced countries, and the asterisk there translates to top 25% of socioeconomic status scores combining educational attainment and per capita GDP. And we get this, of course, from the bottom right, from gunfacts.org, which I highly recommend everybody check out gunfacts.org because there's a lot of just raw data that doesn't fit the narrative on that site, and that explains where all of this research is coming from that you normally hear about and that you normally see. So when we're talking about mass public shootings in advanced countries, we're kind of in the middle, right? So as far as how we fare, we're really not faring that bad. But I'm sure you guys have seen graphs that suggest otherwise. Now, this one says mass public shootings, and I guess if we're going to talk about gun control, then we're going to be talking about homicide. We're going to be talking about murder in general. And the reason that you're not going to see this type of data, the reason that you guys haven't seen these charts, the reason why this might actually be news to you is because you've been lied to. And you're going to be continued to be lied to. I'm sure you guys have seen things like this from CNN, this type of graph. The U.S. has the highest firearm homicide rate in the developed world. I'm sure you've seen things like this listing from PolitiFact of homicide rates and gun homicide rates here. I think this is gun homicide rates against selected countries. And we've got another more complete list from Bloomberg of whatever these countries correspond to, right? The thing is that this is gun homicides, right? Yes, when it comes to gun homicides and comparing us to very wealthy countries, we're kind of an outlier. But they do this as though we can't open up Microsoft Excel, go to their own sources, open up Microsoft Excel, pump in their own data and extrapolate from that non-gun homicides in addition to that. They treat us as though we can't just take their own data from their own super biased sources with clear agendas and look at their own cherry-picked countries with the guns magically removed from the picture using this wonderful tool called Microsoft Excel. I did that. I spent the time and I spent the effort going to their own site, gunpolicy.org, which if you ever wanted to see an anti-gun agenda website, that's it. That's the website, right? And this is what that website looks like. Let me show you what that looks like. We can go into things like death and injury, and we can see total homicides, any method, and use their own data. This is the United States. We can do that with a number of other countries. And then we can go into gun homicides and use their own data and pull the gun homicide rates out of the overall homicide rates, pump that into Excel, and bibbity bobbity boo. What do you get? You get this graph. Let me pull this up. You get this. Bloomberg can do it. So can I. Where do we stand? When it comes to non-gun deaths, gun homicides, we're kind of an outlier when it comes to those exact countries that I just copied and pasted from Bloomberg. And to make this point even clearer so you guys can see this, that's gun and non-gun homicides, right? Here's where we stand when it comes to non-gun homicides. We're still pretty doggone high. And the ones that are ahead of us include Estonia, Latvia. Why the hell did Bloomberg include those countries? And Bloomberg excluded countries like Singapore. They excluded countries like South Korea. Right? And the way I did this was I went to that website, gunpolicy.org, right? And we showed you the example of the United States, and I just took a 10-year average of the gun homicide rate and the regular homicide rate, subtracted one from the other, and 10-year average based on the most recent data that we have 10 years for. Yes, you're going to see that this graph compared to the Bloomberg graph doesn't include all of the countries that were on that Bloomberg graph, because I couldn't get 10 years worth of data from some of these countries. And from some of these countries, the countries are so small that if I can't get a 10-year running average, then there's no point in doing this, because if I'm just using one data point, then because their population sizes are so small, one incident can radically change the rates. Remember, these are rates per 100,000 people. So when you get a country like Luxembourg, which has a population of like 400,000, or Iceland with a population of like 380,000, unless you can get a good number of years worth of data, you're not going to have a large enough sample size to produce relevant results. Right? And again, I'm taking this from a website with an obvious agenda, right? And again, we're still kind of outliers when it comes to those countries when we use the countries that Bloomberg provided, which again, hyper cherry pick countries. No South Korea, no Singapore, no Qatar, no UAE, no Bahrain, no Taiwan. And if we include these countries that are super rich countries, if we're going to include these countries, never mind the tiny European countries, right? The Bloomberg included Luxembourg, but they didn't include Andorra, Monaco, Liechtenstein, San Marino. And if we did, what we would see is that when it comes to non-gun homicides, the United States is still kind of an outlier. Now, I just used the cherry-picked countries that are from that Bloomberg result. So what if we used something like OECD countries? Okay, we actually have that information. And this is what it looks like when it comes to OECD countries. Again, here's the United States. Still pretty terrible outlier. What's below us? Turkey, Chile, Mexico, Latvia, Estonia. Like, I realize that there aren't many gun murders in Estonia and Latvia, but we probably shouldn't be proud of the fact that we have fewer. We probably shouldn't be proud of the fact that we have fewer non-gun deaths than countries where you still have bombs, where countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And I don't know why we continue to compare ourselves to these Baltic states. And yes, this graph was created by a Redditor, so I'm not sure if we can trust it. But the point is clear. The U.S. has a violence problem, not a gun problem. Again, Latvia, the Baltic states are still states where they're using trucks and explosives to kill people, these are still largely backward countries when it comes to violence. And again, you can see that their homicide rate in general is way outside of ours to begin with, right? Now, the lesson to be learned from all the data I've shown, and we've got more, is that the gun isn't the problem. I've shown you the data of what it looks like when we take a Star Trek transporter and just beam me up, Scotty, all the guns out of the equation. We still have a murder problem in this country. We have a problem of culture, not a problem with guns. And again, this is why this result, we've covered this before, but this is why none of the prescriptions made by the gun control groups are borne out in any of the data from within our borders either, right? We went over this on this show before, and I wonder if I have the link to where I've gone over this before. Nope, no, I don't. So it's on this channel. I've gone over. You can go to my Facebook page or my YouTube channel and just type into the search bar on my channel the word gun, and you're going to see a video that says the gun is not the problem, right? And I'm going to go over the same data that we went over in that same video from 2019. Where are we? We are on 8. Yeah. So again, if the gun is the problem, what you would expect is that when it comes to ownership, as ownership increases, as more guns, more homicide, right? More crime. And here in the United States, not the case. Not the case. We can look at we can look at guns per person versus the gun homicide, right? If you don't think crime, this is the thing that matters, right? Like, it's important to point out that gun homicide isn't the only way to kill somebody, that gun crimes aren't the only type of crime. But if we're going to insist on comparing guns per person and the gun homicide rate, well, we can do that. And what you would expect is a parallel line. Nope. Since 1994, from 1994 to 2014, which is the most recent data I have for all of this, guns per person have gone way up. Gun homicides per 100,000 have gone way down, right? And you would expect this to be completely the opposite if the problem was the gun. Well, let's look at the homicide rate versus the firearm ownership around the world. You'd expect a nice line. Not really. Nope. Not a correlation. I mean, if there's a correlation, it seems to be very, very, very slightly negative, which means that as more guns, less crime, less homicide. More guns, less homicide. Now, I would not say that's what this data bears out. I would say what this data bears out is that there's no correlation whatsoever, because if we're going to go based on that trend, our R squared value, our actual correlation value strength is going to be extremely low. All right. Well, now let's look at gun ownership versus various crime rates, because maybe there's, if we get rid of the guns, we get rid of other types of crime. Nope. If we look at locations in the United States, countries that, states in the United States, and their level of gun ownership, and we compare that to various crime rates, no correlation, just a blob. You would expect, again, a line, a trend, a graph, some sort of thing where there's at least some sort of correlation, either positive or negative, when it comes to gun ownership. And in fact, what you would expect if the gun was the problem, when it comes to number of guns in a geography, you'd expect a positive correlation, which is as one number goes up, so does the other. As number of guns goes up, so does number of, in this case is, what do we have here? Homicides, rapes, robberies, aggravated assaults. Nope, complete blob. The one place where homicide rates did go up while gun ownership declined, so a negative correlation, was the UK after its buyback. Here's where we do have an actual correlation, and it's the exact opposite of the narrative. There it is. So we can see the handgun ban, we can see the gun buyback here, and number of firearms went down over time, and crime rate went up. Remember that graph we showed of the United States over that same time period? Crime rates went down, gun ownership went up. So I mean, I'm showing you all of this data for a reason, but the point is, if we're going to have a data-based conversation, then we have to have a conversation that's also based in principle and that's also based in reason as well, and not just study says, and not just show me the study. Because when it comes, another huge part of why reactionary politics is the worst politics is because my response, right, when it comes to policy prescriptions based on these incidences is always going to be that it doesn't matter if homicides go down if people just pick another weapon. If gun homicides go down, if people just pick another weapon, right? If gun homicides go down and overall homicide rate goes up, what have we done? What have we done? Like, have we actually accomplished anything? Like, we care about homicides. We don't really care too much about how that person committed homicide, right? When we go before a judge, the person being tried is being tried for murder one, not murder one with a knife, not murder one with a bomb, not murder one with a gun, not murder one with, a car, a lead pipe, a rope, the candlestick in the observatory with Colonel Mustard, right? That's not how we do this. That's not how we adjudicate this. And that's because what we care about is the fact that somebody was murdered. We care about the fact that there was a murdered. And if gun homicides go down and people just pick another weapon, we haven't done anything. And that's exactly what that data bore out in the UK. So if you've ever heard the myth of the UK, yeah, gun homicides, I suppose, went down. But the overall violent crime rate and the overall homicide rate went up over the same period that it was doing the exact opposite in the United States when gun ownership was exploding. Which is why, of course, as far as policy is concerned, when it comes to the recent shootings, especially in Uvalde, I'm just always going to say the same thing, which is he's just going to buy it illegally. Which, if you guys have been following me on Twitter, and I highly recommend doing so, perhaps I put a link in the conversation. Nah, link is in this video's description. Right? This is here. Let's see if we can pull up this picture. In case you don't get it, let's beat it into your skull. Whatever gun control policy you're going to institute, he would have just bought the gun illegally. Well, we need to change we need to make it illegal for him to have X number of rounds in the mag. He's just going to buy the gun illegally. Well, we need to get rid of the AR-15. Well, then he's just going to buy it illegally. We need to make it illegal too. Well, then he's just gonna break the law. And if you read these nut jobs manifestos, yes, they're just going to break the law. They're just going to get it illegally. So, folks, follow me on Twitter if you want some dank memes like this. And that's going to be my response when it comes to the policy question, no matter what. These policies don't address the root problem, which is why they don't work. Degenerate's going to degenerate. When you give a degenerate money, you've just given a degenerate money. There's still going to be a degenerate. You have to fix the degenerate in the first place, right? And this is why you would otherwise expect places with high gun control measures to have low violent crime rates and vice versa. You would expect that if you have a place that has incredibly high gun control, if that actually works, then it should be borne out in the data. Well, that's not true according to how the FBI measures things. So let's, what's that? That is number 13. Here is gun control ranking by the FBI and states with homicides and violent crime. Yeah, no correlation whatsoever. So what if we went to something like the Brady Score? Maybe you don't like the way that the FBI is issuing its gun control rating. Maybe it's being unfair in rating states in terms of their gun control levels. Let's go to the Brady Score. This is a metric that was invented by the left. This is a metric that was invented by the gun control groups. Yeah, okay. This is a metric that was invented by the gun control groups to establish a score for either a state or a local government's gun control measures. Again, we're using the data that is from the leftist agenda. And here's the correlation. Here's the scattergram. Here's the scattergraph. It's all over the place. There is no correlation whatsoever, right? You might be able to find some sort of, R-squared value of 0.0000 whatever. But I'm sorry, there's no correlation here. There just isn't there. It just isn't there. Now, this is of course, violence. So what about Brady Score versus gun homicides? Because this is what we care most about. Where's the correlation? It's not there. If anything, it seems to me like there's a negative correlation, not a positive one, where it's extremely thin, the correlation in this graph, if there's to be one. But it seems like it's actually negative. As the Brady Score goes down, the gun homicides go down as well, right? So, again, everything I just said about the gun control, not addressing the root problem, it's borne out in the data. All of the gun control policies, If they worked, they would be borne out in the data, and they're not. They're just not. And I'm showing you what that data is. This is based on their own metrics too. And that's before you factor in things like defensive use, right? Like perhaps the reason when you get rid of guns, you have higher crime rate is because of these defensive uses, something that's not even considered when we're talking about gun control policy. So what if we do consider gun control? How are guns used? This is defensive gun use versus violent crime, right? Way, way, way more defensive uses than non-defensive uses, right? And that's even according to the LA Times. So this is a number of studies that have been conducted on this matter, conducted by all kinds of outlets. The one all the way to the left, defensive gun uses, is that blue bar is the LA freaking Times. And yes, this one tiny outlier by Hemingway, right? This one tiny outlier, which is a clear outlier in this data, is the one that everybody goes to. We don't consider any of these other data, which produce a mean of just under 2 million defensive uses, which is way, way, way more than, what does that work out to? What, like 450,000 firearm incidences, which could be suicides. And which could be accidental deaths. So again, this is even coming from the LA Times, that there's way more defensive uses of guns than there are non-defensive uses. And again, another one you'll hear about, another one of these myths you'll hear about is the gun buyback in Australia, right? The gun buyback in Australia happened. They had one mass homicide, right? And all of a sudden, the homicide rate and the crime rates, the gun deaths just fell off a cliff. Well, they declined by the amount that they were already declining by for years. In fact, the exact same amount, right? Not to mention the fact that people are going to say, well, they had no mass homicides. They had no mass shootings after that incident. Yeah, because they had no mass shootings before that incident either. But again, this is straight from the horse's mouth from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. This is number 16. Here we go. There it is. There's that 1996 buyback. And so you can see what I'm talking about. This is the trend. So in the years before the buyback, we're talking about exactly the same decline in gun deaths, all gun deaths, of course, which is mostly attributable to the tremendous decline in gun-related suicides, right? And again, when we're talking about all gun deaths, which is what is usually cited, all of the difference can be accounted for, just about, in suicides. And if you want to get more specific and you want to just look at the homicide rate, well, we have that. Again, we can draw a line. The homicide rate started declining years before the gun buyback in Australia and continued to decline by the exact same rate after the gun buyback. Do you know that actually, of course, the part of the narrative that you'll never hear is that this decline began in perfect coincidence when the Australian government started an initiative that pumped out way more police, that put way more police on the ground. So if you actually want to point to when this change happened, it was when that policy came into effect. All right. The other thing that we should consider is that it's useful to see all of this happening in Australia in context with the United States, where gun ownership was over the same exact time period exploding. That's number 19. Here's what happened in Australia compared to the U.S. So in the U.S., the rate of homicide, the homicide rate decline actually was greater in the U.S. than it was in Australia, again, over the exact same time period when Australia was getting rid of its guns and the U.S. was buying them at an astronomical, at a borderline hyperbolic rate. The gun is not the problem. Repeat, the gun is not the problem. The problem is one of culture. Not for murder in general, not for mass murder like planes and bombs, not for the insanely rare school shootings. You have to look at why they wanted to kill someone in the first place, right? And the Buffalo shooter, we're going to get into that. I am going to have to take an intermission before we get into that while I get some things taken care of. And we're going to get into that. But in the case of the Uvalde shooter, we don't know what motivated him in the first place, right? And we're going to get into actually effective policy in a minute. Yes, the police failed. So you're going to hear, you've heard on Twitter, oh, the good guy with a gun narrative is busted because the police failed. No, the good guy with the gun narrative is not disproved by this one anecdote. The police who failed in this incident, right? And they usually don't. Well, the fact that they failed in the case of this anecdote is not evidence of a population level trend, because anecdotes are not evidence of a population level trend. But the police aren't the only potential good guys with guns. They're not the only potential good guys that could have guns. And yes, in the Uvalde case, the police failed miserably. And the Texas DPS director said so explicitly. This is cut 1. Let me get that up. Here you go.
Hey, with the benefit of hindsight, stand by, stand by, right? I got it. Okay. Hey, for the benefit of hindsight, where I'm sitting now, of course it was not the right decision. It was the wrong decision. Period. There's no excuse for that. But again, I wasn't there, but I'm just telling you, from what we know, we believe there should have been an entry at that as soon as you can. Hey, when there's an active shooter, the rules change. It's no longer, it's no longer a barricaded subject. You don't have time. You don't worry about outer perimeters. And by the way, Texas embraces active shooter training, active shooter certification, and that doctrine requires officers, we don't care what agency you're from, you don't have to have a leader on the scene. Every officer lines up, stacks up, goes and finds where those rounds are being fired at, and keeps shooting until the subject is dead, period.
Which is exactly what every parent of any kid ever would have done, no matter what. They don't care if it's going to take 30 dead parents to get this guy dead, to get the shooter dead. If, think about it like this. If 300 parents are unarmed and just barge into this building, right? And it just becomes a matter of, a war of attrition, and 300 unarmed parents barge into this room, this shooter is going to kill like 30 of them before he finally gets subdued. And these parents bludgeon his skull in, because that's what they're going to do. And rightly so, every parent is going to say, those 30 parents that died, it was a tragedy, but they're heroes. And every one of us would do it again. Every single one of us would do it again. Yes, the police failed miserably. Not only should they obviously have entered, and I think they should get rid of the policy when it comes to schools, right? Here in New Milford, here's a lesson we can learn in New Milford. I really hope this isn't the case, that we have a barricaded shooter differentiation, right? To me, if you're a police officer, right, the barricaded shooter situation should not be a consideration when it comes to school shootings. If there's a school shooting in New Milford and you're a police officer, I don't care if you've only got 3 rounds left in the chamber, you go in. End of story, no matter what. Just like every civilized adult on earth, kids or no kids, is doing, armed or unarmed. And that's exactly what wound up happening in Uvalde, right? Not only did they fail to enter the room, the police actually prevented parents from going in themselves. And this is from The Guardian. So again, remember, we want to go to this. Yep. And we want to get rid of this. Excuse me for going to The Guardian, but when they're right, they're right. Like they point out, more could have been done. Texas police under scrutiny over response to school shooting. Gunman remained barricaded inside a classroom for up to an hour before his rampage was brought to an end. Texas law enforcement agencies are facing escalating criticism over the response to the mass shooting at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde after it emerged that the gunman remained locked inside a classroom for up to an hour, while a large number of police officers massed outside the room without taking any action. And it's going to explain here that what actually took place is not only did they not enter the room, they were straight up arresting parents who were trying to break through the police barricade to get into the room, to get into the school themselves. Straight up arresting them. Straight up preventing parents from getting into there who were willing to sacrifice their own life in the name of saving these kids. We also know that dispatch This was a team effort in terms of a failure. We also know now that for that entire hour, there were kids in those rooms calling and begging for help over the phone, and dispatch blackballed them because they were whispering. And you're not supposed to whisper to dispatch. Of course they were whispering. It was an active shooter situation, and they were hiding in the classroom. And since this was happening over the course of an hour, obviously dispatch had time to go over and go, hey guys, the guy is still shooting kids in the classroom. There are still kids in the classroom. Kick that door in and shoot this guy dead, right? Like, obviously this, I don't even think that when it comes to school, like if this happens at the DMV, that's one thing. But when this comes to kids, like every civilized adult is barging into that room, no matter how well equipped they are, and with a complete disregard for their own safety. And if every sane adult is doing that, then absolutely that should be the policy within police. The barricaded shooter situation consideration should not be made when it comes to school shootings, right? Let me bring up my notes so I can bring things back, right? Again, yeah, the kids were calling 911 from inside the rooms and were getting railroaded by dispatch because they were whispering, and now they're dead, right? This actually speaks to all the more reason to have a broader interpretation of the Second Amendment. If they were your kids and you had a gun and you could assemble some posse, which is what wound up happening anyways to save a lot of these kids, if you could assemble a posse with guns to barge through that police barricade and rescue your children, would you? Would you assemble the New Milford militia to just come in and barge through that police barricade? If we had a New Milford militia that was armed the way the U.S. military is armed, how long do you think the police barricade would have stayed up in force? Do you think they would have said, all right, stand down. You know, the New Milford militia is bringing in tanks and howitzers. Stand down. And for Pete's sake, this is the reason the Second Amendment exists in the first place. This exact situation is why we have a Second Amendment in the first place. For when it comes to tyrannical government and government overreach, it's there specifically so that you can take on government in these situations. And yes, if that means there's going to be a shootout at the Oecd Corral outside the school as well, if it's your kid in there and you have a gun and you can assemble a posse to take on the police first before you take on the shooter, if it's your kid in there, are you doing it? Absolutely. Absolutely. And everyone can understand that. This is the whole point of the Second Amendment. The whole point of your right to defend the lives, to defend the life and liberty and the property that you have produced, either through yourself or through your children, is obviously the reason the Second Amendment was there in the first place. So that the New Milford militia can just bulldoze a police barricade with a tank and howitzers to rescue their kids. And by the way, when it comes to that Second Amendment that we read out, right? Well regulated in 1787 meant all it meant was well trained. Militia meant every able-bodied male. And by the way, that's all part of a subordinate clause, which means the way we get to well-trained, able-bodied males is right to keep and bear arms. The way we are able to have well-trained, able-bodied males is the right to keep and bear arms, which shall not be infringed. Which, if you understand English, is the important part. The shall not be infringed. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And the reason that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed is so that we can have well-trained, able-bodied males. That's what it translates to in the simplest of English. And speaking of this, I just talked about armed parents. How many armed teachers would it have taken to shoot this guy dead? What if you were a teacher in this situation? If you were a teacher in this situation and you had a firearm in your holster, are you hesitating? Are you going to wait outside the classroom? Or are you going to shoot through the glass so you can reach in through the glass of the window, unlock the door, cut up your hand on the glass in the process, kick the door open and just unload into this guy, even if it means you got to die in the process? I know there are teachers that watch this show. I know it. How many teachers? Raise your hand now if you're a teacher and if you had a gun in this situation, you're not hesitating. You're not hesitating.